I thought it might be useful in this overview part of the module to attach a video in which I summarize what we'll be working on for each individual day, to give you a sample of the topics that we'll be discussing, that you will be responding to in the questions posed about the reading and in the week's assignments that are coming ahead. So today we raised the question, what is the New Testament? The New Testament is the second half of the Christian Bible. Christians consider the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible or Jewish scriptures, and the New Testament to be the sacred canon of Scripture, that is, the authoritative text for the religious community. The Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, contains 39 books, actually in Hebrew 24. The Jews divide the books differently than Christians, that were more or less a fixed collection about a century after Jesus lived. The New Testament is important for students to study because it has stood at the center of Western civilization, and thus it's affected all of us, whether or not we consider ourselves Christians. Here's some basic information you'll want to grasp over the course of today's work. The New Testament contains 27 books. All are written in Greek by 15 or 16 different authors between the years 50 of the Common Era and 120 of the Common Era. The writings are of four types. There are Gospels, there is the Acts of the Apostles, then there are several letters, and the New Testament ends with an apocalypse, what some of you may know as the Book of Revelation. The New Testament contains four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and these books tell the story of Jesus' life, ministry, and death. The Gospels were written anonymously and came to be ascribed to disciples, Matthew and John, but also associates of the apostles, Mark and Luke, sometime toward the end of the 2nd century. The Acts of the Apostles was written by the author of the third Gospel, that is, what we call the Gospel of Luke, and its story begins after Jesus' death and describes the spread of Christianity from Palestine to the city of Rome. It focuses primarily on the missionary activity of Paul. Following the Acts of the Apostles are 21 epistles or letters. Most of these New Testament books are records of correspondence between a church leader and a Christian community. These letters address issues of Christian belief, of Christian practice, what we might call ethics. 13 of those letters claim to be written by Paul, although, as we will see, most New Testament scholars doubt the reliability of that claim and would only see 7 of those letters as undisputably being written by Paul. The last book of the New Testament is Revelation, and we call it a Christian apocalypse because it has a character of revealing or revelation. The author of this book, who calls himself John, describes the events leading up to the destruction of this world and the appearance of the world to come. But in this opening day of our work together, we are going to be considering other early Christian writings that are not found in the New Testament. The 27 books of the New Testament are not the only writings of early Christians. There are many other Gospels and letters and apocalypses that are not included in the Christian canon. One important collection of non-canonical early Christian writings includes a series of writings which are collectively called the Apostolic Fathers. These books, written by Christians in the early 2nd century of the Common Era, were considered authority by many early Christians. Some of these writings, in fact, were considered to be as authoritative authoritative as the Gospels or as Paul's letters. Another important collection of early Christian writings, including letters and apocalypses and Gospels, was discovered in Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. And this library, or cache of writings, included 52 different texts written in Coptic or Middle Egyptian, some that were as early as the early 2nd century, so contemporaneous with writings that we find in the New Testament. And so one of our interests in this opening day of our work together is how the New Testament came to be, how some early Christian writings came to be considered authoritative and were collected into a group called a canon, which served as an authoritative guide for life for early Christian communities. Christians were not the only or even the first people to develop a set of authoritative books. Although the Jewish canon was not firmly set until shortly after Jesus' death, portions of that canon were deemed authoritative much earlier. By the end of the 1st century, some Christians considered Jesus' words to be scripture. We hear about that in the letter 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 18. Some Christians also granted Paul's writings authoritative status, and we see that referred to in the letter we call 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 16. The Christian canon, that is a closed collection of writings which were considered authoritative, emerged out of debates among certain Christian groups in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Christians continued to debate the acceptability of early Christian writings. The discussion focused on 3 main issues: whether or not the book was ancient, whether or not the book was written or considered to have been written by an apostle, and 3, whether or not it was widely accepted, widely read among various Christian communities in different geographical locations. It was not until the year 367 that a Christian bishop named Athanasius listed the current 27 books as authoritative Christian scripture. So what are the implications of these ideas for our study of the New Testament as we begin our work for this quarter this summer? Not originally composed as part of the collection, the books of the New Testament embody different points of view. The discussion of the development of the canon shows that there were diverse views among early Christians, and we should not be surprised to find diversity within the New Testament itself. For a historical study of the New Testament, it will help us to read each book independently, taking it on its own terms, understanding its own message, and trying to work through that message to learn something about the community for which it was intended at the time it was written. Not only did early Christian communities have different books, but they also had different versions of the same books. In antiquity, books were copied by hand, letter by letter. This allowed for a number of opportunities for scribal errors, intentional and unintentional, to enter into the text. We don't have the originals of any of the books of the New Testament. All we have are copies that were made much later. The earliest copies derived from the 2nd century, not the 1st century, not the time of Jesus, not immediately after Jesus' death, but in the 2nd century. The copies we do have demonstrate that books changed as they were transmitted. Scholars have collected over 5,000 Greek copies of the New Testament, and no 2 are exactly alike. In fact, there are more differences in the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. The vast majority of these differences are minor, such as spelling differences, but some of the differences are significant. And as we talk about the books individually, we'll talk about those significant differences. This course will use a historical, not a confessional approach to the New Testament and other early Christian writings. That is, we won't be studying these materials as believers, but as people with a historical interest in these documents. It's important to understand the difference between these approaches, because the New Testament is more than simply a Christian book. It's a cultural artifact, a collection of writings that has influenced Western civilization. Reading these books as historical documents makes sense because they were written within a particular historical framework and continue to be read within historical circumstances. Historians deal with past events that are matters of public record. They try to reconstruct what probably happened based upon data that can be examined and evaluated by any interested observer, regardless of his or her religious beliefs. Historians can describe similarities and differences between points of view, but they cannot judge the validity of those points of view because judgment is not a part of the public record. Thus, an historian can describe what likely happened at Jesus' crucifixion, but he or she cannot, as a historian, determine whether or not Jesus died for the sins of the world. Such a judgment stems from one's own theology, from one's own religious belief, not from the public record. History and faith are not mutually exclusive, but they do not share the same constraints, and they don't ask the same sorts of questions. We need to keep that in mind today and in subsequent days as we begin our study of the New Testament. So that's a quick overview of what we have ahead for us today, but also points ahead to what we'll be doing in the days to come as we begin our study.